हेलो दोस्तों, बिजनेस पॉइंट में आपका स्वागत है। और अभी हम कर रहे हैं इकोनॉमी। पहले हमने यहाँ तक कर लिया था, अब करेंगे 2.3 ऑप्टिमल चॉइस ऑफ द कंज्यूमर। द बजट सेट कंसिस्ट of all bundles that are available to the consumer. The consumer can choose her consumption bundle from the budget set, but on what basis does she choose her consumption bundle from the ones that are available to her? In economics, it is assumed that the consumer choose her consumption bundle on the basis of her taste and preferences over the bundles in the budget set. It is generally assumed that the consumer has well defined preferences over the set of all possible bundles. She can compare any two bundles. In the other words, between any two bundles, she either prefers one or to the other, or she is indifferent between the two. Equality of the marginal rate of substitution and the ratio of the prices. The optimum bundle of the consumer is located at the point where the budget line is tangent to one of the indifference curves. If the budget line is tangent to an indifference curve at a point, the absolute value of the slope of the indifference curve MRS and that of the budget line price ratio are same at the point. Recall from our earlier discussion that the slope of the indifference curve is the rate at which the consumer is willing to substitute one good for the others. The slope of the budget line is the rate at which the consumer is able to substitute one good for the other in the market. At the optimum, the two rates should be the same. To see why, consider a point where this is not so. Suppose the MRS at such a point is 2 and suppose the two goods have the same price. At this point, the consumer is willing to give up two mangoes if she is given an extra banana. But in the market, she can buy an extra banana if she gives up just one mango. Therefore, if she buys an extra banana, she can have more of both the goods compared to the bundle represented by the point, and hence move to a preferred bundle. Thus, a point at which the MRS is greater, the price ratio cannot be optimum. A similar argument holds for any point at which the MRS is less than the price ratio. In economics, it is generally assumed that the consumer is a rational individual. A rational individual clearly knows that what is good or what is bad for her in any given situation. She also tries to achieve the best for herself. Thus, not only does a consumer have well defined preferences over the set of available bundles, she also acts according to her preferences from the bundles which are available to her. A rational consumer always chooses the one which gives her maximum satisfaction. In the earlier sections, it was observed that the budget set describes the bundles that are available to the consumer, and her preferences over the available bundles can usually be represented by an indifference map. Therefore, the consumer's problem can also be stated as follows. The rational consumer's problem is to move to point a, to a point on the highest possible indifference curve given her budget set. If such a point exists, where would it be located? The optimum point would be located on the budget line. A point below the budget line cannot be the optimum. Compared to a point below the budget line, there is always some point on the budget line which contains more of at least one of the goods and no less of the other, and is therefore preferred by a consumer whose preferences are monotonic. Therefore, if the consumer's preferences are monotonic for any point below the budget line, there is some point on the budget line which is preferred by the consumer. Points above the budget line are not available to the consumer. Therefore, the optimum most preferred bundle of the consumer would be on the budget line. Where on the budget line will the optimum bundle be located? The point at which the budget line just touched is tangent to one of the indifference curves would be optimum. To see why this is so, note that any point on the budget line other than the point at which it touches the indifference curve lies on a lower difference curve and hence is inferior. Therefore, such a point cannot be the consumer's optimum. The optimum bundle is located on the budget line at the point where the budget line is tangent to an indifference curve. Figure 2.12 illustrates the consumer's optimum. At x1, x2, the budget line is tangent to the black colored indifference curve, the budget thing. The is first thing to note is that the indifference curve just touching the budget line is the highest possible indifference curve given the consumer's budget set. Bundles on the indifference curves about this, like the gray one, are not affordable. Points on the indifference curves below this, like the blue one, ये वाली line जो है, are certainly inferior to the points on the indifference curve, just touching the budget line. Any other point on the budget line lies on a lower indifference curve and hence is inferior to x1 x2. Therefore x1 x2 is the consumer optimum bundle. अब आ जाते हैं डिमांड. In the previous section we studied the choice problem of the consumer and derived the consumer's optimum bundle given the price of goods, the consumer income, and her preferences. It was observed that the amount of a good that the consumer choose optimally depends on the price of the good itself, the prices of other goods, the consumer's income, and her taste or preferences, the quantity of a commodity that a consumer is willing to buy and is able to afford. Given prices of goods and consumers' taste preferences is called demand for the commodity. With whenever one or more of these variables change, the quantity of the good chosen by the consumer is likely to change as well. Here we shall change one of these variables at a time and study how the amount of the good chosen by consumer is related to that variable. Demand curve and the law of demand. If the prices of other goods, the consumer's income, and her taste and preferences remain unchanged, the amount of a good that the consumer optimally chooses becomes entirely dependent on its price. The relation between the consumer's optimal choice of the quantity of a good and its price is very important, and this relation is called the demand function. Thus, the consumer's demand for function for a good. ये क्या है? डिमांड कर्व. ठीक है, प्राइस और क्वांटिटी. एक्स इजिकल टू एफ टी. The demand curve is a relation between the quantity of the good chosen by a consumer and the price of the good. The independent variable price is measured along the vertical axis and dependent variable quantity is measured along the horizontal axis. The demand curve gives the quantity demanded by the consumer at each price. Functions: consider any two variables x and y. A function y is equal to f x is a relation between the two variables x and y such that for each value of x there is an unique value of the variable y. In other words, fx is a rule which assigns an unique value y for each value of x. As the value of y depends on the value of x, y is called the dependent variable and x is called the independent variable. Example: consider for example a situation where x can take the values 0, 1, 2, 3 and suppose corresponding values of y are 10, 15, 18, 20 respectively. Here y and x are related by the function y is equal to fx, which is defined as follows. Yf is equal to कितना हो जाएगा? f0 is equal to 10 or f1 15, f2 18 or f3 20. Example: consider another situation where x can take the value 0, 5, 10 and 20 and suppose corresponding values y 100, 90, 70 and 40 respectively. Here y and x are related by the function y is equal to fx, which is defined as follows. f0 is equal to 100, f10 is equal to 90, f15 is equal to 70 and f20 is equal to 40. Very often a functional relation between the two variables can expressed in algebraic form like y is equal to 5 plus x and y is equal to 50 minus x. A function y is equal to fx is an increasing function if the value of y does not decrease with increase in the value of x. It is a decreasing function If the value of y does not increase with increase in the value of x, the function in example 1 is an increasing function. So is the function y is equal to x plus 5. The function is in example 2 is a decreasing function. The function y is equal to 50 minus x is also decreasing. Graphical representation of a function. A graph of a function y is equal to fx is a diagrammatic representation of the function. Following are the graphs of the functions in the examples given above. y ये हो जाएगा, a इधर आ जाएगा, y is equal to fx. Usually in a graph, the independent variable is measured along the horizontal axis and the dependent variable is measured along the vertical axis. However, in economics, often the opposite is done. The demand curve, for example, is drawn by taking the independent variable price along the vertical axis and the dependent variable quantity along the horizontal axis. The graph of an increasing function is upward sloping or and the graph of a decreasing function is downward sloping. As we can see from the diagrams above, that the graph of y is equal to 5x is upward sloping and that y is equal to 50 minus x is downward sloping. Gives the amount of the good that the consumer chooses at different levels of its price when the other things remain unchanged. The consumer's demand for a good as a function of its price can be written as x is equal to fp, where x denotes the quantity and p denotes the price of good. The demand function can also be represented graphically, as in figure 2.13. The graphical representation of the demand function is called the demand curve. The relation between the consumer's demand for a good and the price of the good is likely to be negative is general. In other words, the amount of a good that a consumer would optimally choose is likely to increase when the price of the good falls, and it is likely to decrease with a rise in the price of the good. Driving a demand curve from the indifferent curves and budget constraint. Consider an individual consuming bananas x1 and mangoes x2 whose income is M and market price x1 and x2, P1 and P2 respectively. Figure A despite her consumption equilibrium at point C where she buys x1 and x2 quantities of bananas and mangoes respectively. In panel B of figure 2.14 we plot P1 against x1 which is the first point of the demand curve for x1. Suppose the price x1 drops to p1 with p2 and m remaining constant. The budget set in panel A expands. A new consumption equilibrium is on a higher indifference curve at point D where she buys more of banana x1 greater than x1 dash. Thus demand for bananas increases as its price drops. We plot p1 against x1 in panel B of figure 20.14 to get the second point of the demand curve for x1. Likewise, the price of bananas can be dropped further to p1 resulting in further increase in consumption of bananas x1. P1 plotted against x1 gives us the third point of the demand curve. Therefore, we observe that a drop in price of bananas results in an increase in quality of bananas purchased by an individual who maximize his utility. The demand curve for bananas is thus negatively sloped. The negative slope of the demand curve can also explained in terms of two effects, namely substitution effect and income effect, that come into play when price of a commodity changes. When bananas become cheaper, the consumer maximizes his utility by substituting bananas for mangoes in order to derive the same level of satisfaction of a price changes, resulting in an increase in demand for bananas. Moreover, as price of bananas drops, consumers' purchasing power increase, which further increase demand for bananas and mangoes. This is the income effect of low change. Low change, income effect of a price change, resulting in further increase in demand for bananas. अब क्या कहते हैं, लॉ ऑफ डिमांड क्या है? लॉ ऑफ डिमांड Law of demand states that other things being equal, there is a negative relation between demand for a commodity and its price. In other words, when price of commodity increases, demand for it falls, and when price of commodity decreases, demand for it rises. Other factors remaining the same. Linear demand Q equals to A minus BP. As linear demand curve can written as dP equals to A minus BP. 0 is smaller than P, Pn is smaller than A upon B, dP equals to 0 or P greater than AB, where A is vertical intercept, minus B is the slope of the demand curve at the price is 0. The demand is A and the price at the price equal to A upon B. The demand is 0. The slope of demand curve measures the rate at which demand changes with respect to its price. किसके रिस्पेक्ट में? प्राइस के रिस्पेक्ट में. For a unit increase in the price of the good, the demand falls by B units. क्या कहना चाह रहा है ये? यूनिट इंक्रीज इन प्राइस ऑफ द गुड्स. अगर कोई गुड है, कोई भी चीज़ है गुड्स है, तो फिर अगर उसकी प्राइस बढ़ती है तो फिर डिमांड क्या हो जाएगी? कम हो जाएगी, क्योंकि ज़्यादातर लोग बाय नहीं कर पाएंगे, कम लोग बाय कर पाएंगे, इसलिए उसकी डिमांड क्या हो जाएगी? बढ़ जाएगी. और अगर कोई चीज़ ज़्यादा है, कोई गुड डिमांड में ज़्यादा है, तो उसकी प्राइस क्या हो जाएगी? कम हो जाएगी. डिमांड मतलब क्या? कि अवेलेबल कितना है वो. ठीक है. Normal and inferior goods. The demand function is a relation between the consumer's demand for a good and its price when other things are given. Instead of studying the relation between the demand for a good and its price, we can also study the relation between the consumer's demand for the good and the income of the consumer. The quantity of a good that the consumer demands can increase or decrease with the rise in income depending on the nature of the good. For most goods, the quantity that a consumer chooses increases as the consumer's income increases and decreases as the consumer's income decreases. Such goods are called normal goods. Thus, a consumer's demand for a normal good moves in the same direction as the income of the consumer. However, there are some goods the demand for which move in the opposite direction of the income of the consumer. Such goods are called inferior goods. As the income of the consumer increases, the demand for an inferior goods falls, and as the income decreases, the demand for an inferior. A rise in the purchasing power income of the consumer can sometimes induce the consumer to reduce the consumption of good. In such a case, the substitution effect and the income effect will work in opposite directions. The demand for such a good can inversely or positively related to its price depending on the relative strength of these two opposing effects. If the substitution effect is stronger than the income effect, the demand for the good and the price of the good would still be inversely related. However, if the income effect is stronger than the substitution effect, the demand for the good would be positively related to its price. Such a good is called giffen good. क्या बोलते हैं इसको? giffen good. Goods rises, उसके कंटिन्यू हो रहा है. Example of inferior goods include low quality of food items like coarse cereals. A good can be normal good for the consumer at the some levels of income and an inferior good for her at another level of income. At very low levels of income, a consumer's demand for low quality cereals can increase with income, but beyond a level, any increase in income of the consumer is likely to reduce her consumption of such food items as she switches to better quality cereals. Substitutes and complements. सब्स्टिट्यूट्स एंड कॉम्प्लीमेंट्स ये पढ़ेंगे अब कल.